What he did was to remind us that we are in the presence of an international system that works if people do in it what they should do. And the role of a national leader in a situation like that is not to get a ride, is not to put their own safety first, but to fight as Winston Churchill had proposed that the British fight if and when it came to that. And what happened over last weekend was that a kind of Trumpish party, a party that used to be a normal enough right of centre party, turned itself into, it was still doing some normal stuff, but it was also completely preoccupied with the 24/7 news cycle. It was completely preoccupied with short-term gotchas on a kind of culture war scale. I'm less interested in the individual issues than in the way in which our politics is realigning itself. Hi, and welcome to Paying Attention with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my friend Peyton Bowman. I'll hand straight over to Bowman, who will introduce what we're going to talk about.
Hi, Nicholas. So today we're going to talk about the recent elections in Australia. And you were talking to me a bit about this and saying it was another Zelensky moment. So I know we talked a bit about Zelensky before on this podcast, but what is a Zelensky moment and why is this one of them?
So I got myself, I had one of my rushes of blood to the head and got myself all excited about what had happened when Zelensky got his camera out and said, "We're not going anywhere. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition." And what I said was, I felt so energized. I felt that there was so much that this changed. One of the things that changed was Europe's and America's sanctions against Russia. They got serious about 3 days after Zelensky did that. If you remember, there was an initial round of sanctions, and the West said, "Oh, these are the strongest we've ever come up with," and they really weren't anything much. And then all of a sudden they were. And Zelensky did that. And what he did was to remind us that we are in the presence of an international system that works if people do in it what they should do. If people play their role. And the role of a national leader in a situation like that is not to get a ride, is not to put their own safety first, but to fight as Winston Churchill had proposed that the British fight if and when it came to that. Now, what's that got to do with the Australian election? Well, I've been pretty upset about what's been happening to politics for a long time now. In fact, not just, since before the internet, the way in which politics turns into a kind of more and more empty performance. And it's been getting so bad since, let's just say since 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. And there's been a kind of madness overtaking the United States. The United States does this from time to time. And things like the big lie, things like the idea that it's impossible for Donald Trump to lose an election unless everyone was stealing votes from him illegitimately and all that kind of stuff. And what's happened in Australia is that for reasons that we can talk about, Australia is particularly well placed, if anyone is, in the English-speaking world to respond to this increasing madness. And what happened over last weekend was that a kind of Trumpish party, a party that used to be a normal enough right of centre party, turned itself into, it was still doing some normal stuff, but it was also completely preoccupied with the 24/7 news cycle. It was completely preoccupied with short-term gotchas on a kind of culture war scale. and it was really getting to be terrible. Now, what happened was that that on the weekend it lost, I think, something like 17 seats, maybe 15 seats. It lost a lot of seats in a house which has got, I think, 127 members. I might be wrong about that. It might be quite a bit. It might be 150. Anyway, it's that order of magnitude. And they lost a lot of seats. They lost a few to their Labor opposition, the equivalent of the Democrats in the United States. They lost one or two or three to the Greens, which is a more left of centre party focused particularly on climate change and environmental issues. And they lost 6 or 7 seats to a new, it's not really a party, it is a new formation in Australian politics, and it is independence. And this began, I suppose, a decade or more ago in a seat which had been occupied by the Conservative opposition, and the MP there, the Member of Parliament there, was a particularly useless one, and she was replaced by a woman called Cathy McGowan in a seat called Indi, and the movement was called Voices of Indi. And it's, as you would realise as an American, it's extremely difficult to fight against the dominance of the major political parties and actually secure a seat in the lower house. So this is not a seat that is elected on proportional representation, which a lot of legislatures in Europe are, and that explains the extent to which the Greens and so on can occupy some seats there. These are seats which go to the person with the greatest number of votes. And so this started and it spread, and now the House of Representatives, which is the same name, we got our name for that chamber off you, the lower house where government is formed, now has a crossbench of members who are not in the opposition and not in the government, of whatever it is, 10, 15. That's a lot of people. And the government will be able to, has a majority, it has a slim majority. But what this does is it sort of swings the focus of politics back towards the centre rather than the point scoring between right and left. And that seems to me to be something very exciting, and also something which, in a sense, was Australia's destiny because of particular aspects of our culture, of our political culture, and certain features of our certain institutional features of the way in which our voting system works.
So this is, just to kind of summarize this as someone who is a little bit outside of, well, obviously,
yeah, well,
as
I said to you before we started recording, Peyton, I'm trying to make your unfamiliarity with all this a feature rather than a bug, so that it can be a way to explain to anyone what's happened in Australia, whether they know a lot about the Australian setup or not, and hopefully will give a lot of people hope and some pointers to what they can be thinking about regarding their own politics. Anyway, you go on.
Yeah, well, I was just saying that, this sounds like a very hopeful situation. And you've used this term, tendrils of hope, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later in this conversation. But just to summarize, what I've been reading in the foreign press, this election has been about climate change. It's been about this kind of movement to the left. It's been about diversity. For you, are any of these themes as important as this shift to the center, or is there some way in which you think the center will be able to approach some of these issues better than, let's say, the tradition, this the previous kind of coalition or leadership of the country.
Yeah. So I'm less interested in the individual issues than in the way in which our politics is realigning itself. The big issues that the independents focused on were climate change. We had a essentially climate denialist government. Well, that's a little harsh, but they tried to do as little as possible. They got dragged into making a commitment to zero emissions by 2050 at the latest conference of the parties. Where was that? In Glasgow, wasn't it? But they weren't serious about it. They weren't legislating for it, and part of the coalition. So it's a coalition between a conservative party called the Liberal Party, and a party based in the bush, based in the country, called it used to be called the Country Party and is now called the National Party. And lots of National Party MPs said as part of their electioneering in the election, oh, well, we said we'd go to zero emissions by 2050, but we just said that, and that's not something we really think is a good idea. And they weren't disciplined. You know, the Prime Minister at the time said, oh, well, people will say that, won't they? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And I'm not, that's boys will be boys, that sort of thing. So it's nice that we're doing something about that. That was the first major issue and probably the most important swing issue in the election. Another was integrity. So the government had been engaged in really quite outrageous and arguably illegal pork barrelling of various kinds. And everyone was saying we need an independent body who can surveil the situation and go after people who are corrupt, as exists in a number of states, most particularly New South Wales, where they ended up recording the Premier of New South Wales on the phone to her boyfriend as they arranged deals with each other. As the Premier arranged to help out the boyfriend in various dealings that he had with the government. Really pretty amazing stuff. And the government of the time, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, said that it was terrible that this anti-corruption commission was exposing all this stuff, that it was trialled by media and that it was being pursued for prurient interest. Well, what they had uncovered was high impropriety, if not criminal behaviour. And apparently this was a terrible thing to have done. And extraordinarily, Scott Morrison made this a sort of calling card saying we're not going to have any kind of integrity body like that. So the independents were ropeable about that. Lots of people were ropeable about that, and that's what happened. So now we get a chance to go back to the centre, but also I think there's also something else which is really important, and to explain what it is. We had for a while in the Senate, which is our upper house, we had a strange arrangement in which, by playing certain games with preferences, and we might talk about the preferential system later, but by playing certain games with preferences, when you have proportional representation, you might elect, say, 12 senators from each state, and the one at the and sometimes and there are 12 senators from each state, and there are half Senate elections. So in every state at every election, there's usually a sixth position, and people can pick up a Senate seat with, I think one picked up a Senate seat with 0.5% of the vote. And the way they did that is they got other people to preference them. And so they got other people. So other candidates, as they dropped out, would pass these preferences on. And there were all these clever preferencing deals. The result, now that's a long story or the background to the fact that the Senate contained all kinds of peculiar politicians. One of them, for instance, was called the Motorists Enthusiasts Party. And I'm pretty sure the guy who represented the Motorists Enthusiast Party was a guy called Ricky Muir. So this guy turned up. He wasn't particularly well educated, and it was a bit like Mr. Smith. Is it Mr.
Yeah.
Smith Goes to Washington?
Yeah, that's right.
The Jimmy Stewart movie.
That's right. Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, Mr. Smith. So he turns up and he's got certain policies that he wants to pursue about being a motoring enthusiast. And apart from that, he listens to the debate and he then votes for the argument that he thinks is the best. Well, I mean, this is unheard of in Parliament. That's not what that's what we like to think Parliament does, but Parliament doesn't do that. The debate happens outside. The log rolling, the number crunching happens internally, and then everybody gets told what to argue. And so although the political class in Australia were spent a lot of their time ridiculing this situation, it was kind of ridiculous. Its very ridiculousness showed that even a ridiculous system that had normal human beings in it did a better job than the system that we had, where everybody was just taking their orders from the party bosses. So what's happened now is that we now have a crossbench in the lower house where the government is formed, the main house which holds the government to account, and over 10 of these people are independents. And so now we will get to see what they think and who they think has the stronger case. And they will still be politicians. They will still be thinking of trying to keep hold of their of support in their local community, but they will also be doing what Edmund Burke in the 18th century argued is the fundamental role of a politician, which is, as he said, some words to the effect of, "I do not owe my constituents my vote, I owe them my judgment." In other words, I understand what they think, I listen to what they think, I value what they think, and they've sent me to Westminster to make the final decision about what's in our community's interest and what's in the nation's interest, and how those considerations can be balanced against one another without regard for party interest. And that is now what is poking its head up above the parapet in Australia, and I couldn't be more excited about it. That's my Zelensky moment, if I could. And those are the tendrils of hope that now you can argue a thing on the merits, and powerful people in our legislature, some of them will say, actually, that person may not command a lot of votes, but what they say makes a lot of sense, and that's a terrific development.
What about the situation makes it a kind of like a unique opportunity because it's happening in Australia?
So I think Australia is a country that has a great deal of pride, somewhat sort of beneath the radar, I suppose, but deep in the Australian psyche is an understanding that at the turn of the 20th century, Australia was the workman's, and it was workmen, not women. It was the workman's paradise. It was a place that had been built from the get-go, and by there I'm referring to European settlement or invasion, if you like, which began in 1770 and got underway properly in 1776. Now, what happened was that this was a penal colony, but you know who was really angry about this? This is a bit of a digression, but it's pretty interesting. Jeremy Bentham was furious about Australia because he had these plans for these brand new institutions, which he called penitentiaries. What people used to do is just stick people on boats in the Thames, whip them, behead them, do all kinds of things if people didn't behave themselves. And here was this idea that you just took them away to the other side of the world and you let them serve out their sentence. But pretty quickly when they got to Australia, they had to start doing work, and and people who used their labour were desperate for that labour. And the result was that even as convicts, the masters, the employers, got quite a lot of lip. So Australia was a place with very high labour, very high wages, and a lot of lip from the workers back to the bosses. And this was quite noticeable in World War One, when the troops were very disciplined, but absolutely uninterested in following stupid instructions from pompous, often British officers. They were very brave, they were very effective. And this, I'm probably just showing you that I've bought into the national mythology, but there are some objective ways that you can show this. They were several inches taller than British troops because they were better nourished. I doubt that was true of American troops, which might have been very similar. We got there earlier and did more fighting per capita by a huge margin. So firstly, Australian political culture and Australian culture generally is famously egalitarian, and that matters and it counts for something. There are two other things which perhaps partly as a result of that are present in the Australian electoral system. One is we have compulsory voting. That's, I think, tremendously important because pretty much everyone is going to vote. It's actually, one way to think about it is that you get fined 70 Australian dollars, about less than 50 American dollars for not voting. It's hardly, life plus hard labour. It's hardly a terrible punishment. But think of it as a negative poll tax. So we have voting rates of certainly well over 90%. What that means is that, yes, political parties want to satisfy their base because they need money and they need people to hand out how to vote cards at polling booths. So they need some organisational volunteer and they need door knocking to go on. But they also need to market their message to the centre. So the question of getting out the vote just isn't an issue in Australia. The vote is the parties put a bit of effort into it, but generally speaking, that's not where the action is. The action is targeting the centre. So that's been very important. And the other thing that I think is really important is preferential voting. Now, what preferential voting does, as opposed to, so the American system, the British system, the Canadian system, surprisingly, I think I'm right in saying that, is a first past the post system, which basically means if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, you just, the candidate that gets the most votes in the first round wins. In France, we just had an election. You remember there was a first round, and I think what happens in the first round is you get the top 2 people. That's probably identified by first past the post, but I'm not sure that's right. But anyway, the second round happening 2 weeks later is the two candidates who have come out of the voting for anyone process, and then people get a second chance. Australia has a process where something similar happens, but it all happens in the polling booth on the one occasion, which is that you vote 1 for your favourite candidate, 2 for your next favourite candidate, and so on. And then if your candidate doesn't get many votes, their second preferences are passed on and your vote is not wasted. So you can vote for a politician who's got a fringe view or a minority view, and if your vote doesn't count because they didn't get enough to really get into the be in play against the incumbent, then it is passed on to the next person and the next person, so that in the end your vote always counts either for the person who wins or the person who came second. So those mechanisms are mechanisms which, again, allow they're sort of ideal in a way, I think, because they allow people to move away from the centre if they want to, in the sense that there are all kinds of parties can start up, and people will vote for them if they believe in them, knowing that they won't waste their vote doing so. But if you want to win, you focus on the centre. So those are those are these three features: the culture and the two features of the voting system that I think are unique in Australia and give us a chance to fight against the forces that we've talked about before. These, what I think of as the centrifugal forces of competitive democracy or democracy by election.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I imagine if I were voting for the motorist, motorist enthusiast?
The motorist enthusiast.
So I was very enthusiastic about my car, and I voted for them, and then I put another vote on that central party. Maybe I wasn't that interested in all the other things that were going on, and you get that vote in there, and it tends to be kind of centric, or centrist, I would imagine. Yeah.
That's
okay, so so Australia has some conditions that are kind of they sort of allow for the centrist coalition to move forward. And I think we talked about some other reasons why in this election that moved a little bit away from the left, moved away from the right. So there was this corruption that you talked a bit about. Are there any other major factors? I know that you characterized the head of this Liberal Party as being kind of Trumpist in a way. Was there an element of this culture war that was really part of this, or was that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. And I just watched an interview this morning. Our Prime Minister on his first day in office flew to Japan and met with Joe Biden and the in the Quad, which is Joe Biden, Narendra Modi, and the Japanese Prime Minister. He came back and he was interviewed on national TV, on a morning national TV program, and he was actually asked a sort of standard gotcha question, a standard hostile question, which was, one of your ministers likened the person who's likely to be the new opposition leader to Voldemort. And it just so happens that Peter Dutton, the man who's also known as Potato Head, does look rather scarily like Voldemort. And Anthony Albanese, the new Prime Minister, didn't duck and weave. He said, yes, Tanya Plibersek had said that, shouldn't have said it. I'm serious about trying to improve the tone of politics in Australia. She's apologised, and we don't have any place for that sort of name calling. So there's a sort of exhaustion with culture war. Now, I do want to say everyone always talks about that. What matters is whether voters will reward it. They like it when they see it, but of course, politicians don't act the way they do because they're inherently nasty, Voldemort-like people, as much as the enemies of Peter Dutton would like to think that he is. They act like that. They stress the negative because that works. And we're a long way from that, so just having a Prime Minister who sounds friendlier is a very small beginning. And what has to happen is that he has to persevere, and then he has to turn it to his advantage, and we have to back him. Will that happen?
Yeah,
we don't know.
So it sounds like the independents that have been recently coming into office could play a big role in whether either helping or hindering that. I mean, what role will they play in this new center, and what challenges do they face?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think it's very, very fortunate for them and very fortunate for the ALP, the new governing party, that the new governing party has a slim majority of the House of Representatives in its own right, so it can form a government. One of the great problems, and I mentioned in my last comment, is that electorates say they want things, but then they vote against them. So they want their parliamentarians to ask themselves the question: is it in the national interest when they make decisions about things? But we've got two examples now of parties in the centre who have tried to play that role. In Australia, we had a group called the Australian Democrats, and usually what happens is that these centrist parties have they end up with a kind of left of centre tinge for some reason. And then when they get placed in a situation where they have to choose between the right and the left leaning party, they're sort of damned if they do and damned if they don't, because a lot of their votes, a lot of the mood of is a sort of an oppositional mood. In Australia, the slogan that stuck with the Australian Democrats is "Keep the bastards honest." And if you go into negotiations firstly, if you support one of the sides and say, well, we've chosen this side over the other side, well, then you're one of the bastards in some sense. You've made a decision, and people can then start campaigning against you. So what happened with the Australian Democrats is that they had various policies, and then in negotiations with the government, they took the view. So I'll give you a very specific example. The Liberal Conservative government of John Howard introduced an across-the-board consumer tax, a VAT or a GST. And they wanted to make it as clean as possible, and the Democrats had a policy that books should be zero rated. In other words, that books should not be taxed. And in negotiations with the government persuaded the Democrats, not necessarily that this promise they'd made or this thing that they'd said was a terrible thing to have said, but they said, well, look, I'll tell you what, we'll give you this, this, and this. We'll give you a whole lot of money for this particular thing, all these other objectives of yours. So the Democrats said, all right, we accept that. And of course, that then creates a live target to campaign against, which is, they say they're keeping the bastards honest, and here they are breaking one of their own promises. This happened in spades with the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom, who had campaigned against increasing student fees for universities, and then in a income contingent loan arrangement. So the government lends students the money, and then they pay it back when they make some income. The Conservative government put up student fees. Now, I don't know the detail, but no doubt the Liberal Democrats were persuaded that they were persuaded to agree to this. They didn't have to agree to it. They would have known that it would have been politically a bit nasty, but they were persuaded to agree to it. Who knows what for? Perhaps for more representation of Liberal Democrat policies in other areas. Well, that was the end of the Liberal Democrats. They had a big constituency among young, well-educated folk, and they were completely ropeable about that. So being in the centre is tough. In Australia, we had Julia Gillard formed a government, to everyone's surprise, with the help of 3 regional independents. And they came from regional Australia, and therefore from electorates which, if they had not voted for the independent, would have voted for a conservative. And these independents, again, sort of taking their life in their hands, negotiated with the Conservative and the Labor leader And it was really quite remarkable. They said they were so grossed out by the irresponsibility of the Conservative leader who said, look, well, I'll just give you anything you want. If you want $1 billion for a hospital nearby, it's yours. That's how they reported it. And they said, that's not responsible. We want to sign up with the Labor government. And they supported the Labor government. And despite the fact that it was a hung parliament or they didn't have a majority, it was one of the most successful parliaments in Australia's history. It actually put through carbon pricing that was then unpicked a bit later on. But that, of course, was the death of two of those independents, Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, because then the Conservative Party was able to campaign against them and say a vote for these people is just a vote for the Labor Party. So that's the backdrop. And what the Labor Party, I'm pretty sure, understands is that they want to govern in such a way that at the end of the next election, when they may need to have the help of the Teal candidate, they'd rather have independents in all these very wealthy in these very wealthy electorates. They would rather have independents there than their traditional opponents, the Conservatives. So it's in the Labor Party's interest to govern in such a way that the independents from those regions are able to go back and say, we were an important part of making Australia a better place. And that means that I think it's in the Labor Party's interest, and certainly in the country's interest, to govern to a substantial extent through those independents, even though right now they don't need those independent support. I think that they will in the future, and it's just a much more sensible way to hang on to the centre of politics and not get too tribal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they almost have to kind of amplify these people's independent nature rather than try to co-opt them or bring them under their kind of their umbrella, so to speak. Yeah.
I think so. I think that's right, and that's what I again. This is my this rush of blood to the head, my Zelensky moment. Who knows if I'm right? Yeah. Who knows if it'll work this way? But one of the implicit issues we've been discussing about electoral systems and about politics is this. I've already used this term, competitive democracy. Is there another way to do competitive democracy? In other words, could we have representatives of the people in a legislature who didn't get there by competing for votes? And the answer is absolutely yes. We could do it in the way that the Athenians did it, which is to select people at random, and the way we do it in juries. And this is a kind of teachable moment, I think, because at the moment in competitive democracy, if certain things happen, then we find politicians spend their time projecting the problems of the community back onto the public in order to exploit them, to build their base and to build their votes, rather than internalize the problems of the country inside the legislature and try to work on solving those problems. And Australia also has a recent history under Prime Minister Bob Hawke, who came to power in 1983, and I was involved at both the beginning and the end of that government, which went out of office in 1996. And what they did is that they came up with a new mechanism to internalize the tensions of politics. So they built this thing called the Accord, and the Accord was it was formally an agreement between the government and the unions, but in fact, the government knew that it had to take into account the interests of business, the interests of employers, and so it was in effect a compact between Australia's unions, the government, the bureaucracy advising the government, and the employer interest. And what that did was that it internalized the big problems that needed to be solved. And there were big problems that needed to be solved. The business community would turn up and say, we need lower wages if we're going to be competitive. The government went to their treasury, their bureaucracy said, is that right? And the treasury said yes. And then they started speaking to the unions saying, okay, how can we bring about this is a Labor government supported by the unions, going to the employees of Australia saying we need to engineer lower real wages. And they did that. And they said, well, if you will agree to moderate your wage claims, we will introduce Medicare, we will introduce a social security system for your retirement, a contributory social security system. So when wages went up, some of them went into pension funds, equivalent of your 401k funds, and so on. And so one of the things this did is that it rendered the Conservative opposition pretty much irrelevant for a number of parliamentary terms because the problems were being sorted out. The problems had been internalised to a process. And so the attempts of the Conservative opposition to drum up hostility and opposition to this process, which everyone could see was a very healthy process of people thrashing out their differences and coming up with ways of acting which didn't necessarily come out of any textbook, but which were compellingly working on the problems, the difficult problems the country had. That was a recipe to be in power for a long time and to do a lot of good, and that's what I think happened in the 1980s.
You've used this word internalize, I think, 4 times, and you know how I'm attracted to keywords like this to some degree. So you also shared with me this expression that you were using: internalize and compromise. Don't divide and conquer. Now, what do you mean by that, and how does that connect to what you were just telling me about?
So that's my slogan for something. You heard it first from me, Peyton, but I'm planning to put on what might be a day-long or half-day sort of training seminar for new MPs or old MPs, but focused on the interests of new MPs, their staff, about how to do government in ways that leave the place better off rather than worse off. And it's going to be a little bit technocratic. It will talk about if you want to support a particular activity, should it be with a subsidy? Should it be with a sort of a capped allowance? If you want to start talking about untouchable issues, like like over too much, we're now starting to ramp up incarceration, not anything like to the level you are, but how are there ways you can deal with things that place systems on a healthy trajectory and cut off unhealthy trajectories? One of the things we've done is this savings system, this pension system that I mentioned, has become a tremendous, set up by the unions, has become a great boon to wealthier people. So there are ways to think about making sure it does its social function and the leakage to the financial engineers is minimized and so on. So I want to put on and I've been talking to a bunch of people. In fact, yesterday I had a long conversation with one of those independents that I mentioned earlier, and I'm hoping to get him along. And so what I want to do in this workshop is to try to paint this picture of the difference between a political process that internalizes problems and solves them by compromise between different people who want different things, to one that divides and conquers, which is the system that you are familiar with in the United States. Another way to put it is culture war. You're just endlessly on in social media and on the mass media. You've got all kinds of focus grouped slogans and talking points. You never answer a damn thing in a straight way. and people hate it. That is an uninhabitable politics, in my opinion, and it's extremely inhabitable, if somewhat challenging from time to time, to internalize these problems and for people to talk to each other, employees to talk to employers. I've watched that happen. I watched that happen in 1983. I watched union leaders who had never met CEOs talk to CEOs, and each of them are in the same room together, and they walk out sort of scratching their head, shaking it a bit and saying, well, he wasn't too bad. So that's what we can try and do. And those are the green shoots of growth, the tendrils of new possibilities. And my point is that these aren't just things that are done by our leaders at the top of a system. If they're playing their role correctly, we can all see new worlds open up of contribution that we can make. I wouldn't have run this kind of seminar 3 years ago, because what would be the point of throwing good money after bad? So that's what I think is at stake here, and why I'm guardedly excited about what's happened and what's possible.
Well, I love this idea of internalizing the political tension, because, the way I see American politics operating is you usually have where you have these big national parties, and they go to their bases and say that, you and your local community are part of the weaker group. You're the weak people. You're the weak faction.
You're getting screwed over. Yeah. You're getting screwed over, and we've got to go.
We're a big, strong national organization that's going to fight for you. So give your allegiance to us, and we'll take care of you. And this approach seems to be so much more humane. It's like, well, we're reaching out to the whole that spectrum and saying, well, there's definitely some tension here, but let's see what we can do. Let's create some space and let new initiatives sort of spring up from there. I think that's, in some sense, what you're saying with this tendrils of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And given that we try and get these talks down to about 45 minutes, we should try and probably wrap up fairly soon. But this takes me back to this idea that this other way to represent the people, namely via sampling, just ordinary people, that's a logic which is very internalizing. So this competitive system, if things are played right and if you have the right culture, then the competitive system, fair bit of the competitive system can internalize problems and solve them. But if you're getting people to compete to represent people, then they have an interest in creating trouble in a bunch of ways. They have an interest in exaggerating the differences rather than compromising and minimizing the differences. And so I think a critical part of this is to try to take this time to build institutions of impeccable democratic legitimacy, which can carry through the spirit of independence and the spirit of internalizing our problems and the spirit of listening to everyday people, not just the people who are very good spokespeople and so on. So that's another thing that I'm hoping we might be able to make some progress on. And if I was to speak more aspirationally, that we might be able to lead the world on. So why not aim high, even though one's chances of getting everything one wants is not necessarily all that good. It's certainly fun to try and do the very best you can for your country, and maybe through that.
Australia's Zelensky moment to become a kind of beacon for the rest of the world. Right?
Very nice. I like that. Absolutely.
Well, this has been really great. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up today?
No, I think it's I've enjoyed just sort of going through the logic of the way I'm thinking now, and not only the way I'm thinking, but
Yeah.
what
Well,
I'm
well, thank you
planning to
very
do
much for
about it.
sharing. It's been really fascinating. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Peyton.